Some truths are buried for a reason. Welcome to Sherlock File. I am your host, Julian Whitmore. Drop your location below. I appreciate every reply. Happy you're here. Let's begin. The hall into which we were shown was of that lofty and somewhat severe character which marks the older English country houses, where comfort was long held subordinate to dignity. A wood fire burned upon the hearth, but the greater part of the apartment lay in shadow, the lamplight catching only here and there upon an ancestral portrait, a suit of armour, or the polished edge of an oaken chest. The butler who admitted us was a large, pale man with a face so composed that it seemed less the result of discipline than of nature. Yet even he could not wholly conceal the nervous alertness with which his eyes travelled from Holmes to myself and back again. "Mr. Marchmont is with his lordship, sir," said he. He gave orders that Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson should be shown in the instant they arrived. Holmes handed him coat and hat, with a glance that missed nothing. "You were the person who found the chapel door open this morning?" The man started, and for the briefest instant his well-bred reserve gave way. "Yes, sir." "At what hour?" "Shortly after 6, sir, when I had gone out to see that the tradesman's entrance was unbolted." "You touched nothing, I trust?" "No, sir. Mr. Marchmont was sent for at once." Holmes nodded as though the answer had fallen within expectation, and followed the servant down a passage lined with dark portraits whose eyes seemed to move in the shifting light. At the end was a door partly open, through which there came the murmur of subdued voices. Mr. Marchmont himself stepped out to receive us, and in his face I read both relief and fresh disquiet. "You are welcome," said he in a low voice. "His lordship is much exhausted, but insists upon seeing you at once." We were ushered into a long library, warm, richly furnished, and oppressive in that way, peculiar to rooms where illness and anxiety have for some time held possession. At the farther side, near a shaded lamp, there sat in a wheeled chair an old man wrapped in a travelling rug, though he was indoors. His face was large-boned and deeply lined, the skin drawn tight across prominent features, while the eyes, though sunken, retained something of command. Illness had reduced but not softened him. One could still discern in Lord Belrude the man who had once ruled house, county, and dependents with unquestioned authority. He gave Holmes a keen look, and then me a shorter one. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you have come quickly." "As quickly as the trains would permit," said Holmes. "I fear that speed will prove desirable in this matter." A faint grimace, half approval and half weariness, passed over the old nobleman's face. "Then Marchmont has not exaggerated. He has been careful rather than extravagant." Lord Belrude laid one frail but veined hand upon the arm of his chair. "You may as well understand, Mr. Holmes, that I dislike the police, resent interference, and have no taste for old scandals. If I consent to your presence, it is because I find myself confronted by a business that has already gone beyond my control." "An admirable reason," said Holmes. "The best clients are those who know the limits of resistance." For the first time something like a spark of humour lit the old man's eye. "You are an impertinent fellow." Holmes bowed. "I have occasionally been called so by persons whose opinions I value." Lord Belrude turned slightly toward Marchmont. "You were right to send for him." There followed a brief silence, during which Holmes stood upon the hearth-rug with that air of loose indifference which concealed his closest attention. I had observed that when he wished a person to speak freely, he often seemed to lower his own intensity, as if to remove the sense of scrutiny. "At your convenience, Lord Belrude," said he, "I should like to hear from your own lips the exact phrase you used upon receiving the Home Office notice." The old man's fingers closed upon the rug. "I said," he answered slowly, "that perhaps the wrong man was buried." "Why did you say it?" "Because the thought came to me." Thoughts so shaped do not usually come without antecedents. A shade of obstinacy settled upon the aristocratic features. "I am an old man, Mr. Holmes. I am not answerable for every phrase forced from me by shock." "No," said Holmes quietly, "but you may become answerable for suppressing the facts which gave it birth." Marchmont stirred uneasily. I feared for an instant that the interview might end then and there. Yet Bellrood only looked harder at Holmes, as one seasoned combatant might assess another. "You press early. I waste little time when graves are to be opened." The old lord's gaze shifted past him toward the darkened windows. "You are aware that my brother-in-law, Adrian Vale, was found drowned upon the lake." "I am aware of the official conclusion." Lord Bellrood gave a dry, mirthless laugh. "Official conclusions! There are times when they are merely the forms by which gentlemen spare their households." "Then the household required sparing?" "It required silence." Holmes took one step nearer. "From what?" For a moment I thought Bellrood would refuse. Then, with visible effort, he said, "From disgrace." The word seemed to linger in the lamplit room. "Whose disgrace?" Holmes asked. The old man raised his head sharply. "You shall not conduct this examination as though I were in the witness box." Holmes's expression did not alter. "As you please, but understand me clearly. Someone entered your family vault last night. Someone removed a statement from your archives. Someone has either revived an old lie or prepared a new one. If your object is still silence at any price, I am the wrong man. If it is truth with the least possible ruin, then you must trust me enough to cease fencing." That directness, which in another would have been insolence, had with Holmes the force of professional necessity. Bellrood's hand loosened again. His voice, when he spoke, was lower. "There was reason at the time to fear that Adrian had entangled himself with people of a dangerous and vulgar kind. Debts, speculations, possibly blackmail. My wife adored him and would hear none of it. I did not admire the man. Yet he remained your guest. For my wife's sake. And on the day of his death," Bellrood's eyes narrowed, "there had been words between us." "Violent words?" "Yes." Marchmont looked genuinely startled, and I inferred that this admission was new even to him. "About money?" said Holmes, partly. "What else?" The old nobleman's jaw set. I declined to answer. Holmes did not insist, an omission which I knew to be deliberate and therefore significant. Instead, he changed his ground with apparent lightness. "You have in your service a Mrs. Staunton." Bellrood's eyelids flickered almost imperceptibly. "Yes." "She has been long in the house?" "Since my wife's early years." "A capable woman?" "Indispensable?" "Trusted?" "Certainly." Holmes turned away as if the matter were settled. "Then I should like to see the chapel vault before dinner, the japanned box of papers afterward, and Mrs. Staunton at the first opportunity." At that precise instant, the library door opened noiselessly, and a woman entered carrying a salver with a medicine glass and covered dish. She was tall, spare, and perfectly self-possessed, with iron-grey hair drawn smoothly beneath a dark cap. Her face was not handsome, yet it possessed that repose which can, in certain natures, be more formidable than beauty. She approached Lord Bellrood without haste, set down the tray, and only then allowed her eyes to rest upon us. "If this is a bad time, my lord," said she, "I can return." There was nothing in the words, everything in the tone. It was the tone of one who was accustomed to pass unchallenged through any room in the house. Holmes inclined his head. "On the contrary, Mrs. Staunton, I have just expressed a wish to make your acquaintance." For the smallest fraction of a second, and I would not have sworn to it had not Holmes later confirmed my impression, her gaze sharpened, not with surprise, but with the cold recognition of a player who sees that the true adversary has at last taken the field. She neither started nor coloured. If there was surprise in her, it had already been mastered before it could reach the surface. "Indeed, sir?" said she. Holmes's expression was one of mild professional courtesy. "Your name has naturally arisen in connection with a household matter of some delicacy." Mrs. Staunton transferred her attention from him to Lord Belrood with the easy directness of one long established in authority. "Shall I leave the draft, my lord?" "No," said Belrood shortly. "You may remain a moment. Mr. Biar Holmes has been engaged to inquire into these disturbances." "I had understood as much from Mr. Marchmont's manner," she returned. "One could hardly suppose that gentlemen would be brought down from London for any common trifle." There was a quiet dryness in her voice which might have passed for composure in a less charged atmosphere. Yet I saw that Holmes watched her with that peculiar detached alertness which he reserved for persons who interested him deeply. "You discovered nothing yourself this morning?" said he. "No, Mr. Holmes, I was informed after the butler had given the alarm." "You did not visit the chapel?" "Not until later." "With Mr. Marchmont?" "Yes." "And the writing upon the stone was then still fresh?" She paused for so slight an interval that another man might have overlooked it. "It appeared so." "Chalk?" "Yes." "Common schoolroom chalk, or the softer mason's kind?" Again that fractional pause. "I could not say. I am not accustomed to examine such things." Holmes smiled faintly. "No, but you are accustomed to observe. Most capable housekeepers are. I have found them among the best witnesses in England." Whether the remark pleased or displeased her, I could not determine. She folded her hands before her apron with exact propriety. "I observe what concerns the running of the house, sir." "Then you have perhaps observed whether any stranger has lately been seen upon the grounds?" "No stranger whom I could identify as such." "A local answer," murmured Holmes. "In the country one never knows where strangeness begins." "You have had no dismissed servants bearing malice?" "Every old house has had dismissed servants." "But none who return in memory at such a moment?" Mrs. Staunton turned her head slightly toward the lamp, and I perceived that her face, though under perfect control, had grown harder in outline. "If you refer to Nathan Pike, the groom," said she, "I have not heard his name spoken for many years." Holmes's eyes rested upon her. "Then you do remember him?" "I remember all who have lived under this roof long enough to trouble it." "An admirable faculty. And Emily Fane?" This time the reaction was unmistakable. It was not alarm in the common sense, but the brief contraction of a person who has received a touch upon a bruised place. Lord Belrood shifted impatiently in his chair. "Must all the dead household be paraded in here?" he snapped. Holmes did not remove his gaze from the housekeeper. "Only those whose voices seem still to carry, my lord," Mrs. Staunton answered before Belrood could speak again. "Emily Fane was a foolish girl," said she. "She saw too much of what was not there and too little of what was. If any paper of hers is missing, I should not suppose the loss to be of consequence. Yet you recall her perfectly. One recalls disturbances." Holmes inclined his head as though satisfied for the moment. "You have been very helpful. I should be obliged if, before the evening is out, you would permit Dr. Watson and me a few further questions." "If Lord Belrood wishes it." Belrood gave a weary gesture of assent. Mrs. Staunton bent over the medicine glass, adjusted it with practised care, and then withdrew with the same noiseless composure with which she had entered. The door had scarcely closed behind her before Holmes turned to Marchmont. "The chapel." Marchmont took up a lamp at once, and I observed that he did so with something of relief, as though the departure from the library promised a freer atmosphere. Belrood made no attempt to detain us. He had sunk back in his chair and stared into the fire with the exhausted fixedness of a man who has said more than he intended, yet not nearly enough. We passed again through the hall where the butler seemed to materialize from the shadows at our approach, and then out by a side door into the evening air. Night had now fully descended. The wind had risen, and with it came that restless whispering among the yews and cedars which gives to old grounds after dark an impression almost human in its uneasiness. Marchmont held the lamp low as we crossed the flagged path. Ahead of us The chapel rose black against a sky in which no star yet showed. I was aware, as we drew nearer, of the faint metallic smell of damp stone and dead leaves. The chapel itself was older than the house, or at least older than its present form. Norman work appeared in the square tower and the heavy arch of the porch, though later hands had altered and repaired much. Marchmont produced a key and opened the outer door. "It has been locked since morning," said he. "I have kept the key upon my person." Holmes took the lamp from him before entering and at once bent toward the threshold. "Humph," said he. "What is it?" I asked. "Too much has passed over this stone since dawn. Still something remains." He knelt for a moment, then rose and moved slowly down the narrow aisle. The interior was small and plain, with a few dark pews, a modest altar, and several mural tablets gleaming palely in the lamplight. At the farther end, beyond the chancel rail, a low iron gate opened upon a short passage descending by worn steps beneath the tower. "The vault lies below," said Marchmont, and I thought his voice had dropped almost involuntarily. Holmes made no reply. He had paused beside one of the front pews and was holding the lamp toward the wood. "Wax," said he. "Recent?" I leaned close and saw a little hardened splash upon the edge of the pew. "From this morning," I suggested. "Possibly. Or from last night." He held the lamp higher. "Notice also that the dust upon the pew back has been disturbed by a sleeve or coat skirt. Someone waited here for at least a minute or two and rested against it." Marchmont stared. "Then there were two persons? Or one with patience. Let us not multiply phantoms until we must." We descended the steps. The air below was markedly colder. At the bottom was a second door, this one of oak, banded with iron. Marchmont unlocked it, and we entered the vault. Though not large, it possessed that oppressive weight of enclosed antiquity, which no modern burial place can imitate. Along the walls were recesses faced with stone and bearing carved tablets or simple inscriptions. In one of these, near the far angle, Holmes halted and raised the lamp. On the inner slab, just above the engraved name of Adrian Vale, there stood, in broad white letters, the message we already knew too well. "Ask who lay in the grave before you open it." The words, crude and almost childish in their medium, were the more sinister for that very reason. Holmes did not at once examine them. Instead, he lowered the lamp and let his glance travel over floor, wall, hinges, and ceiling with extraordinary rapidity. "You said nothing was taken," he observed. "So far as we can tell, nothing." "No attempt at the coffins in the other recesses?" "None." "And this writing was found exactly as it now appears?" "Yes." Holmes stepped closer. "Then the writer was either tall or stood upon something." I saw then that the first line ran higher than a man of ordinary stature might conveniently have written without raising his arm considerably. Holmes handed me the lamp and passed his fingers lightly over the joints of the stone below the chalk marks. "Watson, look at the floor near the right-hand corner." I obeyed and saw, half hidden where the slab met the pavement, a faint crescent of white dust. "Chalk debris," said I. "Just so, but not enough. Most of it has been brushed." "By the culprit? Or by the discoverer? Which, Mr. Marchmont?" The secretary looked genuinely disconcerted. "I cannot say. I did not notice. The butler may have trodden near it." Holmes gave a little sound which in him expressed neither assent nor dissent, but reservation. Then he took the lamp once more and swung it suddenly upward. "There," said he. Above the veil recess, near the corner where the vaulting sprang, was a fresh scrape upon the stone. Marchmont followed his indication. I had not seen it. "No, nor was it meant to be obvious. A metal clasp or button has struck there recently." The writer leaned in from the right side, perhaps bracing himself. He was in haste, but not panic. As Holmes spoke, he dropped to one knee with a swiftness astonishing in so angular a man and peered along the pavement toward the doorway. "And here," said he quietly, "we have our first courtesy from the house." He pointed to a mark upon the floor, a narrow, damp print, already drying at the edge, but still visible where the lamp shone obliquely. It was not the broad sole of a man's outdoor boot. It was the smaller, sharper impression of a woman's shoe. Marchmont gave an involuntary exclamation. "A woman! Then Mrs. Staunton—" Holmes raised his hand. "Pray, do not conclude before we have begun. A footprint is a fact. An inference must be earned. Let us see what it will give us before we burden it with identities." He bent lower, adjusting the lamp so that the light fell obliquely across the stone. The impression, though faint, was sufficiently clear to show a narrow sole, with a slightly pointed toe and a heel more slender than that worn by most countrywomen. "You observe," said he, "that the edge is clean and not yet wholly dried. This was made since the stone acquired its present dampness, therefore within the last 12 hours. The size suggests a woman, but more particularly a woman of some refinement. A servant accustomed to heavy work commonly wears a broader shoe. This is narrower, more carefully shaped." "Then it cannot be one of the maids," I ventured. Holmes glanced at me. "It may be, but it is less likely. Country maids are not usually supplied with such footwear unless they provide it themselves. And if they do, it speaks of vanity or some association beyond their station." Marchmont leaned closer, his face strained. "There are only a few women in the house," said he. "Mrs. Staunton, the upper maid, 2 housemaids, and—" He hesitated. "And?" said Holmes quietly. "My lord's niece, Miss Clara Lorimer. She has been staying with us these last weeks." Holmes's eyes flickered, though his tone remained even. "Ah, a guest. That complicates and enriches matters at once. Does Miss Lorimer frequent the chapel?" "Not to my knowledge. She is fond of walking, but I have never seen her there at night." "At night," repeated Holmes softly. "You assume the visit was nocturnal? The writing was not there yesterday evening?" "Quite so." "Then let us continue." He rose and moved slowly about the vault, pausing at intervals to examine the stonework, the hinges of the door, and the narrow ledge beneath the recesses. At last he returned to the veil inscription and regarded it once more, not with the eye of a reader, but of a craftsman. "The letters," said he, "are formed with deliberation, though not with skill. The hand trembles slightly, not from fear, but from suppressed agitation. The strokes are heavier at the beginning of each word, lighter toward the end. Our writer began with determination and lost steadiness as the sentence progressed." "From fatigue?" I asked. "From thought. He or she was occupied less with the act of writing than with the meaning of what was written." Marchmont passed his hand across his brow. "It is as though the place itself was speaking," he murmured. Holmes straightened. "Places do not speak, Mr. Marchmont. People do. And when they choose stone for their medium, it is because they wish to be heard without being seen." He turned abruptly toward the door. "We have seen enough here for the present. The interest of the vault lies not in what has been done within it, but in what has been brought to it. Come." We retraced our steps to the chapel above. As we emerged into the nave, Holmes paused once more by the pew where he had observed the wax. "Watson, oblige me." He handed me the lamp and, taking out his lens, bent over the hardened drop. "Paraffin," said he. "Common enough, but note the faint trace of scent. Do you perceive it?" I sniffed cautiously. There was indeed a slight odour, not unpleasant. "Lavender? Excellent. A scented candle, then, not the plain variety used for household necessity? Such candles are more often found in bedrooms than in chapels." Our visitor brought her own light. "Then she did not rely upon the chapel lamp?" "Either there is none, or she preferred not to use it. The latter is more suggestive." Marchmont looked from one to the other of us. "You speak as though the matter were already half solved." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, it is only just sufficiently defined to be interesting." We stepped out again into the night. The wind had freshened, and the branches above us stirred with a restless whispering sound. As we crossed the path, Holmes suddenly halted and held up his hand. Listen. From somewhere beyond the yew hedge, in the direction of the lake, there came a faint, irregular sound, a soft splash, followed by a pause, then another. Marchmont started. What is that? Holmes's head was inclined, his whole attitude intent. Water disturbed, said he, not by the wind alone, something or someone moving at the edge. At this hour? At precisely this hour. Without another word, he moved swiftly along the path, keeping to the shadow of the hedge. We followed as best we could, the lamp swaying in Marchmont's hand and casting grotesque shapes among the trees. The ground sloped gently downward, and presently the dark line of the lake showed before us, a dull gleam under the clouded sky. Holmes dropped to a crouch near the bank. "Extinguish the lamp," he whispered. Marchmont hesitated only a moment before complying. We stood in near total darkness, save for the faint sheen of water and the dim outline of the opposite shore. Again came the sound, this time clearer, a pole dipping into water, then lifted. "There," breathed Holmes, a shape moved against the lake's surface, low, indistinct, yet unmistakably a boat. For several seconds we watched in silence. The figure within the boat was little more than a shadow, but I could see that it bent forward, as though probing or searching the water. "What can it mean?" I whispered. Holmes did not answer. He had drawn me slightly back and now pointed toward the near bank. "Observe the line of reeds," he murmured. "Broken in one place, freshly." Even in the darkness I could make out the irregularity. "That is where the body was found?" I asked. "So Marchmont told us." The boat drifted nearer to that very spot. The figure within it paused, then leaned farther over the side. At that instant there came a faint metallic sound, a click, sharp and unmistakable. Holmes's hand closed upon my arm. "A grapple," he said under his breath. The meaning struck me at once. "They are dragging the bottom." "Precisely." The boat shifted again, the pole dipped, and the water broke in a small circle of ripples. "After 20 years, I whispered, "what can they hope to find?" Holmes's grip tightened slightly, though his voice remained calm. "Not what lies there, Watson, but what may have been left." The figure in the boat straightened suddenly as though something had caught. There was a moment's pause, then a slow, deliberate lifting motion. We strained our eyes into the darkness. Something rose from the water, something long and dark, trailing with it a faint gleam as it broke the surface. Before we could distinguish it clearly, a voice rang out from the bank behind us. "Who is there?" The effect was instantaneous. The figure in the boat started violently. There was a splash, a hurried movement, and then the craft swung sharply away from the reeds, its occupant driving it with frantic strokes toward the far side of the lake. Holmes sprang to his feet. "After him!" cried Marchmont, recovering his voice. But Holmes did not move. He stood, watching the retreating shadow, his face unreadable in the darkness. "No," said he quietly. "Let him go for the moment." "But he has something." "Yes," returned Holmes, "and more importantly, he knows now that he is observed." He turned slowly toward the voice that had broken the stillness. A man was approaching from the direction of the house, a lantern in his hand. As he came nearer, the light fell upon his face, revealing a young man of about 30, well-dressed, with a pale, keen expression and eyes that moved quickly from one to another of us. "I heard voices," said he. "What is the meaning of this?" Marchmont stepped forward. "Mr. Cecil Lorimer," said he, "this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes." For a brief instant, as the name was spoken, something like a shadow crossed Lorimer's face, not fear, not surprise, but a swift, calculating recognition. Holmes inclined his head. "You arrive, Mr. Lorimer," said he, "at a moment when the past appears to be making a very determined effort to rise to the surface." Mr. Cecil Lorimer's gaze followed the direction in which the boat had vanished, though by now the darkness had swallowed all trace of it. "I see nothing," said he with a touch of impatience. "What has occurred here?" Holmes stepped aside slightly, allowing the faint reflection of the lake to fall across his face. "A nocturnal fisherman," said he, "whose methods are perhaps less sporting than inquisitive." Lorimer's eyes returned quickly to him. "At this hour? On private water?" "Precisely my objection," Holmes replied. "You would not happen to have authorized such an excursion?" "Certainly not." "Then we are agreed that it is irregular." Marchmont, still agitated, broke in. "He was dragging the bottom at the very spot where Mr. Vale was found." Lorimer turned sharply. "What?" "The pole. We heard it plainly," Marchmont insisted. "And something was brought up. I am convinced of it." Lorimer's expression tightened, though he made an effort to recover his composure. "You must be mistaken," said he. "The light is deceptive. Sounds carry oddly over water." Holmes regarded him with quiet interest. "You are familiar, then, with the behavior of sound upon this lake at night?" "I have lived here long enough," Lorimer returned, perhaps more quickly than he intended. "Ah," said Holmes softly. There was a pause, during which the wind stirred the surface of the water into faint, uneasy ripples. "You came down from the house alone?" Holmes continued. "Yes." "With a lantern prepared?" "I heard voices," said Lorimer. "It is natural that I should bring a light." "Quite so. And you were not, perhaps, already upon your way in this direction?" The question was put so lightly that it might have passed for casual, yet I saw Lorimer's fingers tighten upon the handle of the lantern. "No." Holmes inclined his head as though the answer satisfied him. "Then we have, between us, witnessed a curious coincidence. A stranger intrudes upon the grounds, selects the precise spot of an old tragedy, and proceeds to search beneath the water at the very moment when the case has been officially reopened. It is almost as though someone feared that the lake might yield something before the authorities could intervene." Lorimer's face had grown paler. "You speak in riddles, Mr. Holmes." "I speak in observations. The riddles, if any, are provided by your lake." Marchmont glanced anxiously from one to the other. "What are we to do?" he asked. "Shall we pursue him? He cannot have gone far." Holmes shook his head. "In darkness, upon unfamiliar ground, with a man who has already shown himself prepared? No. We should gain little and risk much. Better to let him believe himself unobserved. But he has taken something." "Possibly, and if so, he values it. That is a fact of greater importance than its immediate recovery." Lorimer gave a short, strained laugh. "You appear remarkably calm in the face of what may be a very serious intrusion." Holmes turned to him. "My dear sir, calmness is the first necessity when facts are scarce. Excitement supplies none." He stepped toward the broken reeds and examined them briefly, running his fingers along the bent stems. "Fresh," said he. "Within the hour. The boat came in close here, just as we saw. The question remains, why here and why now?" "Because of the old story," said Marchmont eagerly. "The drowning—" Holmes raised a hand. "Let us avoid the temptation of easy answers. The obvious explanation is often the least fruitful." He straightened and looked once more across the water, now wholly dark and silent. "Mr. Lorimer," said he, "you have been in residence here during the past weeks. Have you observed any unusual activity about the lake?" Lorimer hesitated, then shook his head. "None." "No lights at night? No disturbances?" "Nothing of the kind." Holmes regarded him for a moment longer, then turned away. "Very good. We shall return to the house. There is little more to be gained here in the dark." We retraced our steps along the path, the lantern once more lit and casting a wavering circle before us. I could not but feel that the atmosphere had altered since we first approached the lake. There was now a sense, difficult to define, that the place had been disturbed, not merely by our presence, but by something more deliberate and concealed. As we walked, Holmes fell into step beside me. "You observed Lorimer?" he murmured. "Closely. He seemed uneasy." More than uneasy, he was prepared. For what? For inquiry. He knew what had been done here tonight, though he did not expect witnesses. You think he is connected with the boat? Holmes's lips curved slightly. I think he is connected with the knowledge of it. That is not quite the same thing. Ahead of us, Marchmont was speaking in low tones to Lorimer, whose replies were brief and constrained. The tension between them was perceptible even without hearing the words. When we reached the house, the butler admitted us at once, his expression betraying a suppressed curiosity which his training could not entirely conceal. "His lordship has retired, sir," said he to Marchmont. "Mrs. Staunton is in the morning room." Holmes paused. "Then we shall not disturb Lord Belrood further tonight. Mr. Marchmont, the papers you mentioned, the japanned box, are they accessible?" "Yes, in the library." "Excellent. Dr. Watson and I will examine them at once. Mr. Lorimer, perhaps you will join us?" Lorimer hesitated only a fraction. "If you wish it." "I do." We entered the library once more, where the fire had been replenished and the lamp turned higher. The japanned box stood upon the table, its lid open as Marchmont had left it. Within lay a carefully arranged collection of documents, yellowed papers, folded letters, and a few brittle newspaper cuttings. Holmes drew his chair close and began to examine them with methodical precision, handling each item as though it were a specimen under glass. I took a place beside him, while Marchmont stood opposite, watching with anxious intensity. Lorimer remained slightly apart, his back to the mantel, though his eyes seldom left Holmes's hands. For some minutes there was no sound save the faint crackle of the fire and the rustle of paper. Then Holmes paused. "This," said he, holding up a sheet, "is the coroner's report, and this, the medical testimony. Quite conventional, no mention of marks of violence, as we were told." He set them aside and took up another. "Newspaper accounts, equally uninformative. The public was given very little." "And the missing statement?" I asked. Holmes's fingers hovered over the remaining papers. "Ah, yes, the absence which is more eloquent than presence." He leaned back slightly, his eyes half closed. "Mr. Marchmont, when you last examined this box, you are certain that Emily Fane's statement was here?" "Absolutely certain." "And it was withdrawn at the time of the inquest?" "Yes, but preserved privately." "Why preserved?" Marchmont hesitated. "As a precaution, perhaps, or because his lordship was not entirely satisfied." Holmes nodded slowly. "Just so. A document inconvenient to the official conclusion, yet not wholly dismissed, and now it has vanished at the very moment when the case is to be reopened." He opened his eyes and looked directly at Lorimer. "That, Mr. Lorimer, is what I should call an unfortunate coincidence." Lorimer met his gaze steadily, though there was a faint tightening about his mouth. "You seem to imply more than coincidence, Mr. Holmes." "I imply nothing yet. But I observe that someone within this house has both motive and opportunity to remove that paper." Marchmont drew a sharp breath. "You cannot mean—" "I mean exactly what I say," Holmes replied calmly. "And until we discover who that person is, every member of this household must, however unwillingly, fall within the circle of suspicion." The words fell heavily in the quiet room. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Holmes rose, closing the lid of the japanned box with a soft, decisive click. "We have reached the point," said he, "at which facts begin to arrange themselves. Tomorrow we shall see whether they are prepared to speak." The tension which Holmes's words had introduced did not readily dissipate. Marchmont stood as though rooted, his hand still resting upon the edge of the table, while Lorimer turned slightly aside, and affecting an interest in the fire which I could not but regard as forced. For my own part, I felt that curious tightening of the nerves which comes when a situation, previously obscure, begins to define itself along lines of human motive. Holmes, however, appeared entirely at ease. He drew out his cigarette case, selected one with care, and lit it with the deliberation of a man whose mind is occupied elsewhere. "It grows late," said he. "Dr. Watson and I will not trespass further upon your hospitality this evening. Tomorrow I shall require the assistance of each of you in turn." Marchmont found his voice first. "You shall have it, Mr. Holmes, whatever is needed." "And you, Mr. Lorimer?" Lorimer turned back, his expression composed, though still somewhat guarded. "I have nothing to conceal," said he. "You may question me as you please." Holmes inclined his head. "That is a fortunate position, and one I hope to confirm." There was just enough ambiguity in the remark to make its reception uncertain. Lorimer's lips compressed slightly, but he made no reply. Marchmont conducted us upstairs to our rooms, which had been prepared in a quiet wing overlooking the grounds. As he paused at the threshold, he lowered his voice. "You saw him?" said he, "at the lake." "I saw a man in a boat," returned Holmes. "And you suspect—" "I suspect nothing," said Holmes calmly. "I observe. Suspicion is a luxury we cannot yet afford." Marchmont looked troubled. "Yet you spoke as though—" "As though I intended to learn the truth." "That is correct." The secretary hesitated, then added, "There is one thing more I should tell you. It may be of no consequence. Yet, after what we witnessed, I cannot be certain." Holmes turned his keen gaze upon him. "Well?" "2 nights ago," said Marchmont, "I was passing through the lower corridor near the back staircase. It was late, past midnight. I heard a sound from the direction of the garden door. When I went to look, I found it unlatched." "Unlatched?" "Yes, I secured it at once. At the time, I thought little of it, but now—" "Now you think someone may have gone out to the lake," Holmes finished, "or returned from it?" Holmes nodded slowly. "That is more valuable than you suppose. Good night, Mr. Marchmont. Pray sleep if you can." When he had gone, I turned to my friend. "You attach importance to that?" "Considerable." "And to Lorimer?" Holmes removed his coat and laid it carefully across a chair. "To his reactions, yes. To his statements, less so." "You believe he was the man in the boat?" Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, belief is the last refuge of the unimaginative. Let us confine ourselves to possibilities. Lorimer knew more than he admitted. That is certain. Whether he acted upon that knowledge tonight remains to be seen." "And the footprint in the vault?" "Ah!" Holmes seated himself upon the edge of the bed, his long fingers steepled. "There lies a more delicate thread. A woman entered that vault recently, secretly, and with purpose. She carried her own light, wrote her message, and departed with sufficient care to leave only the faintest trace behind. That argues both nerve and familiarity." "Familiarity with the house? Or with the necessity?" I considered this in silence. "You think it was Mrs. Staunton?" I said at last. "I think Mrs. Staunton is a woman who does not easily betray herself," Holmes replied, "which is not the same thing." He rose and crossed to the window. The curtains were undrawn, and beyond them the grounds lay in a dim and restless darkness. For some moments he stood without speaking, his profile outlined faintly against the glass. "Watson," said he at length, "there are 3 movements in this game. The first is the reopening of the past. The second is the attempt to control what that past may reveal. The third—" He paused. "Well?" I prompted. "The third is the action taken when control begins to fail." "You mean tonight's incident?" "Precisely. Someone has already ceased to rely upon silence and has begun to act." "Then we are in danger?" Holmes turned, his eyes bright with that cold, eager light I had learned to associate with his most serious cases. "My dear fellow, we are always in danger, intellectually if not physically, when we deal with concealed motives and desperate people. The question is not whether danger exists, but whether it is understood." He extinguished the lamp beside the bed and moved toward his own room, which communicated with mine by a narrow door. "I shall rise early," said he. "There is much to be seen before the household is fully astir." "And sleep?" "I shall take what is necessary." With that he was gone, leaving me to my own reflections. I cannot say that I slept well. The events of the evening, coupled with the oppressive atmosphere of the house, combined to keep my mind in a state of restless activity. More than once I found myself listening intently for sounds within the corridor or beyond the window. Once I thought I heard a faint movement below, perhaps a door softly closed, but when I rose and looked out, I could distinguish nothing beyond the shifting outlines of trees and the dim gleam of the lake in the distance. At last, toward morning, I fell into a troubled sleep from which I was awakened by a light touch upon my shoulder. Holmes stood beside the bed, fully dressed, his manner alert and composed. "Up, Watson," said he quietly. "The day has begun, and with it, I think, the first clear answer." I sprang up at once. "What is it?" "Come and see." Within a few minutes we were descending the staircase, the house still silent about us. The early light had scarcely penetrated the windows, and the air retained the chill of night. Holmes led the way, not toward the library or the front of the house, but along the lower corridor which Marchmont had mentioned. At the far end stood a narrow door, now slightly ajar. Holmes paused before it and glanced at me. "Observe," said he. The latch bore a faint mark, as though it had been recently handled with less than perfect care. Beyond the door lay the garden, pale with the first hint of dawn. "It was secured last night," I said. "So Mr. Marchmont believed." Holmes pushed the door gently open and stepped outside. The ground beyond was soft with dew, and at once he bent down, examining it closely. "There," said he. I followed his gaze and saw, impressed clearly upon the damp earth, a series of footprints leading away from the house toward the darker mass of trees beyond. "They are fresh," I said. "Within the hour." "And returning?" Holmes's eyes moved swiftly over the ground. "No," said he. At that moment there came a sudden cry from within the house, a woman's voice, sharp with alarm. Holmes straightened instantly. "That," said he, "is the third movement." The cry rang again, this time nearer and unmistakably charged with terror. Holmes was already moving. He crossed the threshold in 2 strides, and I followed close at his heels as we hurried along the corridor toward the sound. A door stood open ahead, and within it we found Marchmont, pale and shaken, facing Mrs. Staunton, whose composure, though not entirely broken, showed a rigidity which spoke of strong emotion held forcibly in check. "It is Miss Lorimer," said Marchmont hoarsely. "She is not in her room." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Since when?" "She was seen last night at dinner. This morning her bed has not been slept in." Mrs. Staunton spoke, her voice level, though her hands were tightly clasped. "I went myself. The window is unlatched." "Which room?" said Holmes. "This way." We followed her swiftly up the staircase and along a passage to a chamber at the corner of the house. The door stood wide, and as we entered I saw at once that the statement was true. The bed, though turned down, bore no sign of use. The coverlet lay smooth, untouched. Holmes went straight to the window. It opened inward, and beyond it the ground fell away in a gentle slope toward the gardens. The latch hung loose. He leaned out, scanning the earth below. "Watson," said he, "join me." I looked where he indicated and saw, clearly marked in the damp soil, the continuation of the footprints we had observed at the garden door. They led directly from beneath the window toward the trees and beyond. Marchmont uttered a low exclamation. "Then she has gone out, alone." Holmes turned back into the room, his expression grave but controlled. "Alone, yes, but not, I think, without purpose." Mrs. Staunton stood near the door, her gaze fixed upon Holmes with an intensity which I could not mistake. "You believe she has done this of her own will?" she said. "I believe," Holmes replied, "that Miss Lorimer left this room deliberately and in full possession of her faculties." "Then she is in danger," said Marchmont. Holmes shook his head slightly. "That remains to be seen. Danger may lie in absence, but it may also lie in what she has gone to do. He crossed to the dressing table and examined its contents with rapid precision. No sign of disorder, he murmured. She has taken a cloak, yes, and walking shoes. Not a flight, then, but an excursion. At this hour? Marchmont cried. At precisely this hour, said Holmes, echoing his earlier words. Mrs. Staunton stepped forward. You speak as though you expected this. Holmes met her gaze. I expected movement. Whether it would take this form was uncertain. Her lips tightened. You should have warned us. I should have warned you, said Holmes quietly. Had I known whom to warn. For the first time her composure faltered. It was but a slight thing, a flicker in the eyes, a momentary loss of that rigid control. But it was enough to confirm what I had already begun to suspect, that beneath her calm exterior there lay knowledge not yet disclosed. Holmes turned abruptly to Marchmont. We must follow her trail at once. Delay will cost us clarity. But the house will keep. This concerns the lake, and whatever lies connected with it. He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at Mrs. Staunton. You will remain here, said he, and you will ensure that nothing in this room is touched until I return. She inclined her head, though her expression remained unreadable. As you wish. Within minutes we were again outside, the early light now spreading faintly across the grounds. The air was cold and still, the silence broken only by the distant call of a bird and the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. Holmes led the way, following the line of footprints with unerring precision. They passed beneath the trees and across the open stretch toward the lake, their direction unmistakable. She came this way, said I, toward the very spot where the boat was last night. Holmes finished. The implication was clear. Whatever had occurred upon the lake had not ended with the departure of the unknown intruder. We reached the edge of the water. The reeds, already disturbed from the previous night, showed fresh signs of passage. Holmes knelt and examined them closely. Recent, said he. Within the last hour. She came here and entered the boat. Then she has gone out upon the lake alone, said Marchmont, his anxiety increasing. Holmes pointed silently. A small boat lay moored a short distance along the bank, its rope trailing loosely in the water. She has not gone far, said he. We approached it together. The boat rocked gently as Holmes steadied it and looked within. There, upon the worn wooden seat, lay a coil of thin rope, and beside it a small iron grappling hook. The same implement, I said. The very same, or its twin, Holmes replied. Marchmont stared in bewilderment. But how? Why? Holmes did not answer at once. He was examining the interior of the boat with minute attention, his fingers tracing the edges, his eyes noting every mark. At last he straightened. She has taken something, said he. Taken, I echoed. Yes, and she has not gone far. He pointed toward the center of the lake. There, scarcely visible in the growing light, a dark shape floated upon the water, something larger than a mere ripple, yet too low to be a boat. Marchmont's breath caught. What is it? Holmes's voice was very quiet. That, I think, is what was brought up last night. Without further hesitation, he stepped into the boat and seized the oars. Come, Watson. I followed at once, while Marchmont remained upon the bank, too agitated to act with decision. Holmes pushed off, and we moved swiftly across the still water toward the floating shape. As we drew nearer, its form became clearer, a dark, sodden mass, irregular in outline, drifting slowly with the faint current. Holmes rested on the oars and reached forward, catching it with the hook. Steady, said he. Together we drew it alongside and lifted it into the boat. It was a heavy bundle, wrapped in rotting canvas and bound with cord. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Holmes cut the cord with his knife. The canvas fell back. Within lay a human skeleton, But it was not the skeleton itself which held our attention. It was the object clasped within its bony hands, a small, rusted metal box, still secured by a corroded lock. Holmes stared at it, his expression suddenly intent. "Now," said he softly, "here we begin to understand." For some moments we remained motionless, the little boat drifting gently as the water lapped against its sides. The grey light of morning had strengthened enough to show, with terrible clarity, the details of the thing before us. The canvas, long soaked and decayed, had split where Holmes's knife had passed. The bones within were stained and discoloured by their long immersion, yet sufficiently preserved to leave no doubt as to their nature. It was no recent concealment. The skeleton had lain there, hidden beneath the surface of the lake, for many years. Holmes was the first to move. He bent forward once more, his keen eyes fixed not upon the bones themselves, but upon the small iron box which they still clutched. "Observe the grip," said he quietly. "The fingers have not been arranged after death. The contraction is natural, the last action of life, preserved by circumstance." "You mean," I said, "that the man held this box as he died?" "Precisely." "And was weighted and sunk with it," I added. Holmes gave a slight nod. "The cord about the canvas, see how it has been fastened. There are traces of additional weight, now lost, no doubt, through corrosion or displacement. The intention was clear, to ensure that the body did not rise." I looked out across the still water, a chill creeping through me which had little to do with the morning air. "Then this was no accident," said I. Holmes's voice was calm, almost cold. "No, Watson, this man did not drown by mischance." He took up the metal box, examining it closely. Though rusted and discoloured, it remained intact, its lid secured by a small lock now eaten with age. "Sealed," said he, "and carefully so. Whatever lies within was meant to be preserved. Can it be opened?" "With care, and perhaps not here." He glanced toward the shore. Marchmont stood where we had left him, his figure rigid, his face turned toward us in anxious expectation. "We must return," said Holmes. "This is no place for further examination." We pushed off at once, the weight of our grim discovery shifting the balance of the boat as we turned. I could not help but look back at the disturbed water where the skeleton had been raised, and it seemed to me that the lake, so quiet now, concealed more than it had yet yielded. When we reached the bank, Marchmont hurried forward. "Well," he cried, "what have you found?" Holmes stepped ashore and motioned for him to look. The secretary recoiled as his eyes fell upon the contents of the boat. "Good God!" he whispered. "A body! Another body!" "Not another," said Holmes quietly. "The true one?" Marchmont stared at him, uncomprehending. "You mean—" "I mean that the man officially buried as Adrian Vale may not have been Adrian Vale at all." The words struck him like a physical blow. Then whose grave—" "That," said Holmes, "is precisely the question our anonymous correspondent has urged us to ask." Marchmont passed a trembling hand across his face. "And Miss Lorimer? She has taken this from the lake?" Holmes shook his head. "No, she came here after it had been raised. The position of the boat and the state of the cord suggest that the bundle was brought up last night, by the man we observed. Miss Lorimer has merely followed where he began." "Then where is she now?" Holmes's eyes swept the far bank. "That is what we must discover next." He turned back to the skeleton, and with a care that bordered on reverence, drew the canvas once more over it. "This must be taken to the house at once, and privately. Until we understand its full significance, it must not fall into careless hands." Marchmont nodded, though his agitation made him scarcely capable of speech. Between us we carried the grim burden up from the lake and along the path toward the house. The morning had now fully broken, and with it came an incongruous sense of ordinary life, the distant sound of a servant moving within, the faint clatter of crockery, the everyday rhythms of a household unaware of the revelation being borne toward it. Holmes, however, showed no sign of distraction. His mind was clearly advancing along some rapid and ordered line of thought. "Watson," said he as we walked, Let us review. A body is discovered in the lake, weighted and concealed. A second body, presumed to be the same, is buried with full ceremony. The case is closed as accidental. Years pass, then without warning, the past is stirred. Why? Because someone has learned the truth, I said. Or because someone fears that the truth may be learned, Holmes corrected. The distinction is important. And the box? Holmes tapped it lightly where it lay, wrapped beside the skeleton. The key to motive, in all probability. Documents, perhaps, letters, evidence of some transaction or crime. Something worth killing for and preserving. We reached the house and entered by the same lower door. Holmes directed that the body be taken to a small, unused room off the corridor where it could be secured without attracting attention. Marchmont, though still shaken, complied with admirable efficiency. When at last the door was closed and we stood alone with our discovery, Holmes knelt once more beside it. "Now," said he, "we shall see what our dead friend has to tell us." He took out his knife and with delicate care worked at the rusted lock. It resisted at first, but age had done its work, and after a few moments there came a faint snap. Holmes lifted the lid. Within lay a packet of papers, tightly wrapped in oilskin. He drew them out and unfolded the covering. At the top was a letter, yellowed but still legible. Holmes read the first lines, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw in his face a flash of genuine astonishment. "Watson," said he slowly, "we have been misled, not by appearances but by time." "What do you mean?" He handed me the letter. The name at the bottom struck me at once. It was not Adrian Vale. It was Lord Belrude. I read the signature twice before the full implication reached me. "Lord Belrude!" I exclaimed. "Then this letter, this box, it belonged to him?" Holmes took the paper back and held it nearer the light, his eyes moving rapidly across the faded lines. "No," said he quietly. "It was written by him, but not for himself. Observe the tone." He handed it to me again, and this time I forced myself to attend more carefully. The writing, though firm, bore signs of strain. The phrasing was direct, almost severe. "You leave me no choice. If these matters become public, they will ruin not only you, but the house itself. I have borne much already for my sister's sake. I will not be made the instrument of my own disgrace. Come to the lake at dusk, and we shall settle this between us once and for all." The letter was unsigned beyond the name, yet the authority of it was unmistakable. "It was addressed to Adrian Vale," said I slowly, "beyond reasonable doubt. And found here, in the hands of the skeleton. Then this body must be—" Holmes raised a hand. "Let us not outrun the evidence. It is highly probable that the remains are those of Adrian Vale, but we must prove, not assume." He turned to the other papers, unfolding them with increasing interest. There were several letters written in different hands and a small bundle of what appeared to be financial documents. Holmes sorted them swiftly. "Debts," said he, "large ones. Speculations, as Lord Belrude indicated, unwise and in some cases fraudulent. And here? Ah!" He held up another letter. "This," said he, "is from a third party, a man named Harrington. He speaks of certain arrangements and threatens exposure unless payments are continued." "Blackmail?" I said. "Precisely. Adrian Vale was not merely reckless, he was entangled, and he sought to draw his brother-in-law into the affair." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Now we begin to see the shape of the thing. You think Belrude killed him?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he rose and began to pace the room, his long strides measured and deliberate. "Consider the position," said he. "A man of rank and reputation is threatened with exposure through the actions of his wife's brother. The brother is desperate, compromised, and pressing for assistance. A meeting is arranged at the lake at dusk, and afterward the brother is found drowned, the matter declared accidental, and the evidence, this box, disappears beneath the water. It points clearly enough, I said. It points, but it does not yet prove, Holmes replied. There are still gaps, serious gaps. Such as? Such as the second body. I stared at him. Second body? The one buried in the vault. A cold sensation crept over me. You mean the body interred as Adrian Vale may not be Adrian Vale at all? But then whose? That, said Holmes, is the central question, and until we answer it, we do not know whether Lord Belrood is a murderer or something far more complex. At that moment, there came a knock at the door, followed by Marchmont's voice. Mr. Holmes, may I enter? Certainly. The secretary came in, his face pale but composed. I have seen to matters as you directed, said he. No one is aware, beyond ourselves, of what has been found. Excellent, said Holmes. And Miss Lorimer? Marchmont hesitated. She has returned. Returned? I repeated. Yes, not 10 minutes ago. She was found near the lower path, coming back from the direction of the lake. She appeared agitated. Holmes's expression sharpened at once. Did she see you? No. She went directly to her room. And Mrs. Staunton? She is with her now. Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. Then we must not delay. Mr. Marchmont, you will say nothing of our discovery. Not yet. Do you understand? Perfectly. Holmes gathered the papers swiftly, replacing them within the box. These will remain here, for the moment. Lock the door when we leave. He turned to Watson, we are about to test our first hypothesis. And that is? That Miss Lorimer knows more than she intends to tell, and that Mrs. Staunton knows more than she dares to reveal. We left the room at once and made our way upstairs. The house, though now fully awake, seemed subdued, as though some instinctive awareness of disturbance had spread among its occupants. At Miss Lorimer's door, Holmes paused and knocked. There was a moment's silence. Then Mrs. Staunton's voice. Who is there? Mr. Holmes. A brief pause, then the door opened. Mrs. Staunton stood before us, her expression composed, though her eyes were watchful. Miss Lorimer is indisposed, said she. She cannot receive visitors. Holmes inclined his head slightly. I fear the matter will not admit of delay. From within the room came a voice, low but clear. Let them come in. Mrs. Staunton stepped aside. We entered. Miss Clara Lorimer sat near the window, still wrapped in a cloak, her face pale but resolute. There was something in her expression which struck me at once, not fear, but determination. Holmes bowed. I regret the necessity of troubling you, Miss Lorimer, but circumstances— I know why you have come, she said. Holmes paused. Indeed? She met his gaze steadily. You have found it. There was no mistaking the meaning. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. And what do you suppose we have found? The truth, she said, or at least the part of it that was hidden. A silence followed. Then Holmes spoke very quietly. Miss Lorimer, before this goes further, I must ask you one question. When you went to the lake this morning, what did you hope to recover? For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Not recover, she said. Prevent. Holmes took a step forward. Prevent what? She hesitated, just for a moment. From being used, she said at last. Holmes did not at once reply. He stood looking at her with that singular stillness which I had come to recognize as the outward sign of his most active thought. Miss Lorimer met his gaze without flinching, though I could see that the effort cost her something. Mrs. Staunton, meanwhile, had withdrawn slightly toward the hearth, where she stood with folded hands, her face once more composed, yet watchful. At whose hands? Holmes asked at last. Miss Lorimer hesitated, and in that hesitation I sensed the precise point at which knowledge struggled with restraint. At any hands, she said, there are things which, once brought to light, cannot be controlled. They destroy everything they touch. Holmes inclined his head slightly. You speak as one who has already weighed the consequences. I have, she returned. And yet you came to the lake this morning, alone, armed with a grapple. Her composure faltered for the briefest instant. You saw that? I see what is before me, said Holmes quietly, and I infer what must have preceded it. You followed someone, did you not? Miss Lorimer's eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly, toward Mrs. Staunton. Holmes caught the glance at once. Ah, said he softly, then we begin to approach the centre. Mrs. Staunton stepped forward. If you have questions, Mr. Holmes, said she, you may address them to me. There is no need to distress Miss Lorimer further. Holmes turned his attention to her with an expression of polite interest. On the contrary, Mrs. Staunton, I should be most reluctant to exclude you from a discussion in which you appear to have taken so active a part. Her lips tightened slightly. I do not understand you. Then allow me to assist your understanding. You have lived in this house long enough to know its history, not the version presented to the world, but the truth beneath it. You knew of Adrian Vale's character, of his difficulties, and of the circumstances surrounding his death. More than that, you knew that something had been concealed. Marchmont, who had remained near the door, gave a low exclamation. Mrs. Staunton, can this be? She did not look at him. Her eyes remained fixed upon Holmes. You speak very confidently, said she. I speak from evidence, Holmes replied. You recognized the significance of the letter. You understood the danger of the exhumation. And last night, you entered the vault. For the first time, her composure broke. Not entirely, but enough to reveal the strain beneath. You have no proof of that, she said. Holmes's voice remained calm. The footprint in the vault was made by a woman wearing a narrow shoe, such as yours. The wax upon the pew bears the scent of lavender, such as is used in your private rooms, and the writing upon the stone, though disguised, betrays a hand accustomed to discipline and control. You sought to warn, to delay, to prevent. Mrs. Staunton drew a long breath. And if I did, she said. Then you acted from knowledge, Holmes returned. The question is, whose knowledge? There was a silence. Miss Lorimer had risen now, her hands clasped before her, her face pale but resolute. It was not hers alone, she said. Mrs. Staunton turned sharply. Clara, no. But the younger woman shook her head. It must be told, she said. It has gone too far. Holmes stepped slightly aside as though yielding the floor. Then pray proceed, said he. Miss Lorimer looked from one to the other of us, as if measuring the weight of what she was about to reveal. My uncle, she began, has lived for nearly 20 years under a shadow, not of suspicion, no one ever suspected, but of certainty. He knew, always, that what was believed to have happened at the lake was not the truth. Marchmont stared at her in astonishment. You mean, he knew Adrian Vale did not drown? Yes, she said quietly. He knew that Adrian did not die in the way it was said. Holmes's eyes did not leave her face. And how did he know? Because he was there. The words fell with quiet finality. A profound silence followed. Go on, said Holmes. Miss Lorimer drew a steadying breath. There was a meeting, as you have already learned. From the letter. My uncle went to the lake to confront Adrian. There had been threats, demands, things that could not be allowed to continue. They quarrelled, violently. Adrian struck him. There was a struggle. And then? I asked. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. Adrian fell into the water. Holmes's voice was very quiet. Accidentally? I believe so, she said. My uncle always believed so. He tried to save him, but it was dark, and Adrian could not swim. He sank. Marchmont sank into a chair, his face ashen. Then it was an accident after all. No, said Holmes. All eyes turned to him. Not an accident, he repeated. An opportunity. Miss Lorimer stared at him. What do you mean? Holmes's expression had grown very grave. I mean, said he, that your uncle did not leave the lake alone that night. A sharp intake of breath came from Mrs. Staunton. You are wrong, she said. Holmes shook his head slowly. No, Mrs. Staunton. It is here that your knowledge begins, and your silence has endured. Adrian Vale did not leave that meeting alive, but neither did another man leave it free. He stepped forward, his voice gaining in quiet intensity. The body found in the lake, the one buried as Adrian Vale, was not Adrian Vale at all. It was the body of another man, substituted deliberately to conceal the truth. Miss Lorimer's face had gone white. No, she whispered. That cannot be. Holmes's gaze held hers. And yet, said he, we have just recovered Adrian Vale, from the bottom of the lake, where he has lain these 20 years, holding the evidence your uncle sought to hide. The room seemed to close in upon us. And the man who was buried in his place, Holmes continued, is the one whose identity will reveal everything. For several seconds, no one spoke. The revelation seemed to hang in the air, too grave to be grasped at once. Miss Lorimer had sunk back into her chair, her hands pressed tightly together, while Marchmont stared from her to Holmes with an expression bordering upon disbelief. Mrs. Staunton alone remained upright, though the colour had left her face. You are wrong, she said again, but now there was less certainty in her tone. You must be wrong. Holmes regarded her steadily. Then explain, said he. Explain how Adrian Vale's body comes to be in the lake, weighted, concealed, and clutching documents which point to deliberate action, while another man is buried in his name with all the formalities of a public death. Mrs. Staunton did not answer at once. Her composure, though still outwardly present, was clearly under strain. It was Miss Lorimer who spoke again, her voice low but urgent. There was no other man, she said. My uncle told me everything. He told me that Adrian fell, that he drowned, that the body was recovered. Holmes raised his hand gently. Your uncle told you what he believed, or what he wished to believe. But facts are less accommodating than memory. He turned to Marchmont. You have seen the remains we recovered? Yes, said the secretary faintly. And you have seen the contents of the box? Yes. Then you will agree that we are not dealing with conjecture, but with evidence. Marchmont swallowed hard. It would seem so. Holmes nodded and resumed. Let us consider the sequence. Adrian Vale meets Lord Belrood at the lake. There is a quarrel, a struggle, and Adrian falls into the water. At that moment, your uncle believes him dead or beyond saving. He is confronted with a choice to raise the alarm and risk exposure of the entire affair, or to conceal what has occurred. Miss Lorimer shook her head. He would never. Holmes's voice remained calm, but firm. He had already written a letter which speaks of desperation. He knew what was at stake, his reputation, his position, perhaps even his liberty. In such circumstances, men have done worse. Mrs. Staunton stepped forward. You speak as though you had been there, she said. Holmes inclined his head slightly. No, but I have seen enough of human nature to recognize its patterns. He paused, then continued. What follows is the crucial point. Adrian Vale's body does not rise. It is either secured, intentionally, or remains undiscovered. Time passes. Then another body is found, one which can be identified, or made to be identified, as Adrian Vale. Marchmont looked up sharply. But where could such a body come from? Holmes's eyes rested upon him. From the very circle in which Adrian Vale moved. There was a moment's silence. You mentioned, Holmes went on, a man named Harrington, a blackmailer, a confederate, perhaps an accomplice in Vale's dealings. Suppose that man came to Belrood Court, seeking money or leverage. Suppose he encountered Lord Belrood, already shaken by the events at the lake. Suppose further that he became inconvenient. The implication was unmistakable. "You mean," said Marchmont slowly, "that this Harrington may be the man who was buried in Adrian Vale's place?" Miss Lorimer covered her face with her hands. "No," she whispered. "No." Mrs. Staunton closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, the last trace of resistance seemed to have gone from her. "It was not as you say," she said quietly. "Not entirely." Holmes regarded her intently. "Then tell us how it was." She drew a long breath. "I was there," she said. The words fell with quiet finality. "I was not meant to hear, but I did. I saw them go toward the lake. I followed, at a distance. I heard the quarrel, the struggle. I saw Adrian fall." Miss Lorimer looked up, her eyes wide. "You never told me—" "There was nothing to tell that would not destroy everything," Mrs. Staunton replied. She continued, her voice steady though low. "Your uncle was beside himself. He tried to reach him, but it was too late. The water had closed. He stood there, unable to act, unable to think. And then—" She paused. "Yes," said Holmes. "Another man came." Holmes's gaze sharpened.
"Harrington? I did not know his name then, but yes, a man of that sort. He had followed Adrian, perhaps to press him further. He saw what had happened, and he understood at once." "And he used it," Holmes said. "Yes. He threatened, demanded silence, money, everything. Your uncle was in no state to resist. He agreed. Anything to keep the matter from becoming known." "And then?" Mrs. Staunton's hands tightened. "Then it changed. The man grew bolder, crueler. He returned again late, after midnight. I saw them together near the lake once more. There was another struggle." "And this time?" Holmes prompted. "This time it was not an accident," she said. A silence followed. "Your uncle—" I began. She shook her head. "No, he could not. He was not that kind of man. But in the struggle, the man slipped, fell, struck his head. He did not rise." Holmes's eyes did not leave her face. "And Lord Belrood?" "He was relieved," she said simply. "Relieved that the threat was gone. But then came the question what to do. And the answer was to substitute the body." "Yes." Marchmont sank back, stunned. "Good God, how they brought him up at dawn," Mrs. Staunton continued. "There was confusion, fear, but also opportunity. The body was dressed, identified as Adrian Vale. The inquest was hurried. No one wished to look too closely. And Adrian himself," her voice faltered for the first time, "was left where he had fallen," Holmes finished. "Yes." The room was very still. "And the box?" Holmes asked. "He had it with him," she said. "I saw it that night. Your uncle tried to recover it, but could not find it in the darkness.
Later, when it was gone, he believed it lost forever. Holmes nodded slowly. "Until now?" Miss Lorimer looked up, her face pale but resolute. "And the warning?" she said. "The letter, the writing in the vault." Holmes turned toward her. "That," said he, "belongs to the present, not the past. And it tells us that someone else has discovered what we now know, and intends to use it." He paused, his expression hardening slightly. "And that," he added, "is the danger, which is only just beginning." Holmes's words had scarcely fallen when there came a firm knock at the door. Before any of us could speak, it opened, and Mr. Cecil Lorimer entered without waiting to be announced. His appearance was composed, yet there was in his manner a decision which had not been present before. His eyes moved quickly about the room, taking in each face in turn, and then rested upon Holmes. "I think," said he, "that it is time this matter was brought to an end." Holmes regarded him steadily. "I am entirely of your opinion," said he. "You have been patient, Mr. Lorimer, remarkably so. I was beginning to wonder how long you would wait." A flicker of something, half irritation, half admiration, crossed Lorimer's face. "Then you know?" he said. "I know enough," Holmes replied. "The remainder you will perhaps supply?" Lorimer closed the door behind him and came forward into the room. "Very well," said he. "Since concealment is no longer possible, I shall save us all the trouble of further pretense." Miss Lorimer rose abruptly. "Cecil, what are you saying?" He did not look at her. "I am saying that the game is over." Holmes folded his arms. "You were at the lake last night," said he. "You raised the body." "Yes." "And you returned this morning to secure what you had found, but were forestalled by Miss Lorimer." Lorimer inclined his head slightly. She was more observant than I had credited. Miss Lorimer stared at him in horror. You were the one—" "I was the one who finally brought the truth to the surface," he said, coolly. "Something which, it appears, this household has taken great pains to avoid for nearly 20 years. Marchmont stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "By what right, sir? What concern is this of yours?" Lorimer's eyes flashed. "By every right that belongs to a man who refuses to see justice buried with the dead." Holmes interposed quietly. "Justice is an interesting word, Mr. Lorimer. It may mean many things depending upon who employs it. In your case, I think it means leverage." Lorimer's gaze returned to him. "You are a perceptive man, Mr. Holmes." "And you," said Holmes, "are an ambitious one." There was no denial. "You discovered the truth some time ago," Holmes continued. "Not recently. This has not been the work of a single night. You learned of the substitution, of the missing evidence, of the body in the lake. And you waited." "Yes," said Lorimer simply. "For the right moment." "For the effective moment," Holmes nodded. "The reopening of the case, the anonymous letter, the warning in the vault, these were your work." "They were necessary," Lorimer replied. "Without them, the matter would have remained buried, as it has been for 20 years. "Buried," Holmes echoed softly, "until it could be made profitable." Lorimer's lips curved slightly. "You speak as though I were the villain of this piece. Yet what have I done? I have uncovered a crime, a deliberate concealment of death, a fraud upon the law. And I have done so without violence, without deception, beyond what was required." Holmes's eyes hardened. "You have done so with calculation. There is a difference." Miss Lorimer stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You meant to use this, to force my uncle." "To compel him," Lorimer corrected, "to make restitution for what was done, and perhaps to recognize that the past cannot be suppressed indefinitely." "By blackmail," said Holmes quietly. Lorimer shrugged. "Call it what you will." Holmes was silent for a moment, then spoke with quiet precision. "You miscalculated in one respect." "And that is?" "You assumed that the truth, once revealed, would remain within your control." Lorimer's expression altered slightly. "And it will not." Holmes shook his head. "No, because you are not the only person who now possesses it." He turned to Marchmont. "You will send at once for Inspector Lestrade. The matter is now beyond private arrangement." Marchmont hesitated, glancing toward Lord Belrood's absent presence, then nodded. "It shall be done." Lorimer made a slight movement, as though to protest, then checked himself. "So that is your conclusion," said he, "to hand the matter over to the police?" "It is not a conclusion," Holmes replied. "It is the necessary consequence." "And Lord Belrood?" Lorimer asked. Holmes's voice softened, though it lost none of its firmness. "Lord Belrood will answer for what he has done, and for what he has permitted. But there is a distinction to be made. The death of Adrian Vale may have been accidental. The death of the other man, Harrington, was not premeditated. The concealment, however, that is another matter." Mrs. Staunton stepped forward, her face drawn but resolute. "I will speak for him," she said. I have been silent too long. Holmes inclined his head. You will have the opportunity. Miss Lorimer had sunk back into her chair, her face pale but composed now with a kind of quiet resignation. And the rest of us? She said. Holmes looked at her with a gentleness rare in him. The rest of you, said he, will learn what it is to live without shadows. There was a long silence. Lorimer at last gave a short, bitter laugh. So ends my grand design, said he. Holmes regarded him steadily. Not entirely. You have succeeded in one thing, and that is, you have ensured that the truth is known. Lorimer's expression shifted, something like reflection passing across it. Then perhaps, he said slowly, that is enough. He turned away, and for the first time since his entrance, there was no calculation in his manner, only a certain weary acceptance. The events which followed need not be set down in full detail. Inspector Lestrade arrived that afternoon, and with him the machinery of the law. Statements were taken, evidence examined, and the long-buried facts brought at last into the open. Lord Belrood, when confronted, did not deny what had occurred. Age and illness had already done much to soften the consequences which might otherwise have been severe, yet the weight of revelation was punishment enough. The body recovered from the lake was formally identified as Adrian Vale. The remains in the vault, upon further examination, were indeed those of the unfortunate Harrington. Thus the warning, "Ask who lay in the grave before you open it," found its grim and literal answer. As for Lorimer, his part in the affair was viewed with a complexity which matched the nature of his actions. He had uncovered the truth, but for reasons not wholly honourable. Whether he acted as avenger or opportunist was left for others to decide. It was some days later, as Holmes and I sat once more in our familiar rooms in Baker Street, that I ventured to return to the matter. "You do not seem entirely satisfied," said I. Holmes, who had been leaning back with his eyes half closed, opened them and smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, satisfaction is a rare luxury in such cases. We have arrived at the truth, but it is not a comfortable one." "No," I admitted, "there is something peculiarly tragic in it." "Tragic," said Holmes, "because it is human. A moment's violence, a decision made in fear, and the consequences extend across decades. That is the real lesson of Belrood." He rose and moved to the window, looking out upon the busy street below. "Remember this," he added. "The past is never truly buried. It waits, patiently, for the moment when it may be called to account. And in this case—" Holmes turned, his expression once more composed. "In this case, Watson," said he, "it should indeed have never been reopened." With that he took up his violin and, as though the matter were already receding into memory, began to play.